Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Caitlin Hopkins has a PhD from Harvard, and she served as the research associate for the Harvard and Slavery Project for 2 years. She knows a lot about the place that we call home, and again, we're going to have plenty of opportunity for Q&A. Put it in the chat box. But without further ado, Caitlin, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here, and especially talking to people who know something about Brattle Street and want to know more. I know some of the people here actually live in the houses that we'll be talking about today, so that's really exciting because you both have a chance to learn about the history of the house and also to bring your knowledge and what you've learned about your houses as well. And so I'm excited about that. Just so you know a little bit more about me, in my graduate work, I worked on 17th and 18th century New England, mostly material culture. And then for 2 years, I worked on this Harvard and Slavery project. So I was mostly working alone in the archives, generating a long report for Harvard about Harvard's ties to slavery. And I think there might be a couple of people here from the Harvard and Slavery Initiative, so they may have taken a look at that report. But I got to know the archives really well, not just the Harvard archives, but the holdings at the Cambridge Public Library, the Cambridge Historical Commission, the state of Massachusetts archives. And also I traveled. I went to the UK National Archives in London, all researching about Harvard and Cambridge and its history, its historical connections to slavery. And a lot of those connections are to Brattle Street. And so I'm really happy to be talking to you tonight. I'm going to share my screen. The first slide that I have has my email address. And so anyone who wants to talk to me more about any of these things, or if we can connect to talk about resources, especially if you're looking for resources in the UK, Jamaica, or Antigua, I can probably help you with those. And so I'm going to put my email up right here. It's just caitlinhopkins@gmail.com. Very easy. Okay. So I wanted to start with postcards. You may recognize postcards like this. They're super common in Cambridge. They'll often have the Longfellow House or or Elmwood, the James Russell Lowell House. And you can pick these up for a couple of bucks on eBay. And I find them really interesting because they talk about how we remember these places on Brattle Street, and how in the 19th century, a lot of these houses on Brattle Street became sort of emblematic of New England architecture and New England literature and intellectual life. And so this postcard I thought was really interesting because it talks about the houses. We've got the Longfellow House there and then Elmwood, and it says when they were built, but it doesn't really talk about why they were built or who built them or that kind of history. It just says, this is Longfellow's house, this is Lowell's house, and doesn't talk about who built those houses. So today I want to talk mostly, there's Longfellow House today, or at Christmas, probably more accurately with the wreath on the door. I wanted to talk about a lot of houses on Brattle Street, but particularly these three: the Henry Vassall House, Longfellow House, and Elmwood, which are kind of an extended single site. When we talk about Brattle Street, it's a neighborhood, but it's also a family. There's an extended family that lives on Brattle Street. They're all very intermarried. And a lot of these families get their wealth from enslaving hundreds of people on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in Antigua and Jamaica, principally. And these sugar planters who then live on Brattle Street and have their plantations elsewhere, a lot of them intermarried. And so one thing you'll notice is there's some confusing genealogy. The point is not to learn the details of the genealogy, but just to understand that a lot of these families that live in these houses are intermarried, that there's sort of a small community of very wealthy slave owners with these connections to the Caribbean, and a lot of them marry each other. Great. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is is there, is this map, this 1776 map of Brattle Street that some of you may be familiar with. If you want a really high quality version of this map, you can find it on the Library of Congress website. So it's freely available. And this is a map drawn by Henry Pelham, and it shows some of the houses that you're familiar with. The Oliver House, which is Elmwood, which isn't on Brattle Street anymore because the street has moved a little bit, but it was on the road to Watertown in the 1770s. The Fairweather House, Hooper Lee Nichols House, Sewell House, and then this Colonel Vassall is the Longfellow House. And this unlabeled over here is the Henry Vassall House. So as we just sort of go down the street, a lot of these families have connections to Caribbean sugar. And before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty of their genealogy, I just wanted to make a larger point, which is that connections to the Caribbean, economic connections between New England and the Caribbean, are not just a matter of these few families who were very, very wealthy. The whole New England economy was very connected to the Caribbean sugar plantation economy. And so if you leave this talk remembering just one thing, I think that's the one takeaway, is that the whole New England economy was really closely connected to the Caribbean economy. So when you think about, what you might have learned, in middle school about what agricultural products each of the colonies made, you might remember like New England, and they would say, timber for ships, and then fish, right, are some of the big New England products. But what often those middle school books didn't say was the fish, this dried fish, was going to Caribbean sugar plantations as provisions for enslaved people. And so New England and its agricultural products were really closely connected to places like Antigua. Because think about Antigua, it's a very small island. The climate was good for growing sugar. And so what the sugar planters did was they cut down everything on Antigua that wasn't sugar. They planted the whole island in sugar. The island couldn't feed itself. It didn't have enough room to grow crops or raise livestock. Not even enough manpower was put into fishing. We shipped fish to Antigua from Massachusetts. We even shipped fresh water to Antigua. There wasn't enough water on Antigua. And during the American Revolution, when that trade was cut off, there was actually a gigantic famine in Antigua because they didn't have the agricultural products coming in from New England anymore. And so when we think about these colonies, it can seem separate because now they're separate countries. But in the 18th century, under the British colonial system, it's almost as if New England is kind of a support colony to some of these sugar islands, right? That their agricultural produce goes not just into feeding themselves, but into feeding the enslaved people in these slave labor camps on the sugar islands. And, in the early 18th century, about 50% of New England shipping was going directly to the Caribbean or coming directly from the Caribbean. So it was big business, not just for these families who owned sugar plantations, but for all the merchants, all the people who were fishing and drying the fish, for people who were owning rum distilleries, right? So ships would go to the Caribbean and pick up molasses and bring it back to Boston where it was distilled into rum. A lot of the New England economy was closely connected to the Caribbean. Okay. The first family I want to talk about is the Vassalls. You probably know the Vassalls because the Longfellow House is the Vassall Craigie Longfellow House. And there's also another Vassall house right across Brattle Street from the Longfellow House. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Vassalls today. The Vassalls are an old Massachusetts family. How old? Well, this is the Massachusetts Charter of 1629, and there are 26 original patentees of the colony of Massachusetts, and 2 of them are Vassalls, William and Samuel, these brothers. William and Samuel were tremendously involved with the slave trade. So they were stockholders in the Guinea Company, which was one of the major slave trading companies in London. So they actually only I think only Samuel actually came to Massachusetts, and William stayed in London, but they were heavily involved in slave trading at the highest level, not just owning a ship or something, but owning the company that controlled all British slave trading in that period. They also owned plantations in Jamaica. So if you know about the history of Jamaica, in 1655, the British captured Jamaica from the Spanish, and the Vassalls are one of the very first British families to claim land on Jamaica after it was captured by the British. So they become tremendous landholders in Jamaica. This is just a map of the western part of Jamaica, and these are some of the Vassall family plantations that they owned in Jamaica. And it's actually quite a partial list, because I only went through and found plantations owned by people whose name was Vassall, but they also had daughters who married other plantation owners. So their reach was farther than this, but this is just plantations owned by Vassalls who were named Vassall. And one of the ways that the Vassalls got to be so rich was through the very simple act of staying alive. So in the 18th century, Jamaica was a really, really terrible disease environment. Typhoid, malaria, all sorts of diseases in Jamaica that very famously sort of were very fatal to a lot of European settlers. And there's a great book about this by Vincent Brown, who's a professor at Harvard. It's called The Reaper's Garden. It's a great book about mortality in Jamaica and the way that enslaved people were able to sort of use the death rate among white slave owners to exercise some power in Jamaica. So I recommend that to you, The Reaper's Garden. And one of the people who you'll meet in that book is a guy named Florentius Vassall, who is a brother of someone we'll meet a little later. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to hit you with a little genealogy, not too much. And remember, the point is not to know everybody. The point is to know that they're very closely connected. So someone you might know their name on this list is Isaac Royal. Royal House out in Medford. Isaac Royal Sr. is the one who builds Royal House, and then his son Isaac Royal Jr. is the one who gave the gift that founded Harvard Law School. So you might have heard about the Royals a little bit. Isaac Royal's wife, Elizabeth Brown, had a daughter from another marriage, and she had a son, Thomas Oliver. Thomas Oliver was born in Antigua. The Royals are an Antigua family, not a Jamaica family. So Thomas Oliver was born in Antigua and came to Massachusetts when he was a teenager, went to Harvard, and built Elmwood, which is now the Harvard president's mansion. Over here we have the Vassalls. I hope, because my screen is covering up that part a little bit, but we should have Ruth and Leonard Vassall over here. Now, Ruth and Leonard Vassall had a bunch of kids, like 15 kids. I didn't put them all on here because I wasn't going to talk about them all, but just know that they had a bunch of kids. And Leonard himself was one of 7 Vassall brothers. So like when I talked about them being huge slave owners and landowners in Jamaica, part of it is just there were a lot of them. And to have 7 sons survive to adulthood in Jamaica at that time was unusual, and part of the reason why they spread and gained so much power. Well, Leonard brought his family to Massachusetts in about 1718, 1720, and he built a house, which you might know his house. His house is Peacefield, which is the John and Abigail Adams house out at the Adams National Park, their homestead. That was Leonard Vassall's house, and they bought it after the American Revolution. But Leonard Vassall was an absentee sugar planter. He owned several plantations in Jamaica, and he had a whole bunch of sons: Louis, John, William, Henry, and a lot of daughters who also married other planters. Now, one of the things, since I did all of this research on Harvard and slavery, I just wanted to put in that a lot of these guys are Harvard grads. These are their Harvard graduation years. So this is a family that came to Massachusetts, sent its sons to Harvard, became a big Harvard family, and also a big Brattle Street family. So one of the marriages that we have, and I had to get creative about how to show some of these marriages. So Penelope Royal, who's Isaac Royal's daughter, married Henry Vassall. Elizabeth Vassall married Thomas Oliver. And then Elizabeth Oliver married John Vassall. So John and Thomas, who were of the same generation, they both married each of their sisters named Elizabeth. And you will find if you try to do any genealogy in this family that all of the women are named Elizabeth. So good luck to you there. But what it means is that, so if we're looking at this chart, so Thomas Oliver built Elmwood, John Vassall built the Longfellow House, Henry Vassall lived across the street in that house. And so this is an extended family all living in these houses on Brattle Street. Okay, back to our map for a minute. I wanted to just kind of go down the street, house by house, and just do like a quick short thing about who's living in each of these houses. This map, again, is from 1776. So some of the people who are on this map are not the original builders of the houses. So first at the top, we've got Thomas Oliver. He owns plantations in Antigua, and he's married to Elizabeth Vassall, whose family has money from their plantations in Jamaica. They also enslave 11 people in their house. So there are 11 enslaved people living in Elmwood in 1774, which is when the Olivers abandon it on the eve of the Revolution. The next house is the Fairweather House, which was built by George Ruggles, who was also a slave owner and plantation owner with plantations in Jamaica. And he was married to Susanna Vassall. So she's also one of Leonard's daughters. So to keep it simple, which it's not, Susanna Vassall is Elizabeth Vassall's aunt. So it's a niece and an aunt living next door to each other. The next house is the Hooper Lee Nichols house. And I will leave the history of the Hooper Lee Nichols house to other experts. I know that there's been much more research on this done by the Cambridge Historical Society, but we do know that there were also some of the owners of this house were also enslavers, and enslaved people may have lived there. The next one is it says Judge Sewell. That house was built by Richard Leechmere, who made his money in rum distilling, which is one of these he didn't own a plantation, but his business was built on sugar products. The next house is John Vassall's house, and then across the street is the house of Henry Vassall and Penelope Royal, who we talked about a little bit. One thing that's really important to know about here is that, so the white families are all intermarried and are kind of a big family. But the enslaved families who lived in these houses were also an extended family. So for example, some of the enslaved people who lived in the Henry Vassall house were people that Penelope Royal brought with her from her father's house in Medford, from the Isaac Royal house. And so they had relatives and friends there. I know the Isaac Royal house isn't on Brattle Street, so it falls a little bit outside of your purview, but the museum there, the Royal House and Slave Quarters, has done tremendous work, amazing work, not just historical, but also archaeological. And it's really possible to think of that site as a part of the Brattle Street neighborhood because these people were so intermarried and so closely connected in so many ways, not just the house owners, but also the enslaved people who lived in the house. So people like Cuba Vassall, who was a woman who lived in the Henry Vassall house and was enslaved by first Henry and Penelope Vassall, and then she was later sold to John Vassall across the street. She was born in Antigua, came to Massachusetts from the Antiguan sugar plantations, and then came from Isaac Royal's house in Medford to Brattle Street. So her life and her journey connects those places, the Caribbean sugar plantation, the house in Medford, and then the house on Brattle Street. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Vassall family plantations because there is sometimes when people talk about slavery in New England, there's sometimes a sort of a sense that slavery in New England was somehow smaller or lesser than slavery in other places, than in the American South or in the Caribbean. And I just want to disrupt that for you because, well, for a couple of reasons. One reason is that slavery in New England was very different from slavery on a plantation in that enslaved people often lived in a house with the people who enslaved them. They were often separated from their family members, and that had its own kind of violence attached to it. To be in contact with the enslaver all the time was a different kind of violence, perhaps, but it's still a really violent and dangerous situation for enslaved people. But I also wanted to talk about these plantations in Jamaica and emphasize to you that the Vassall plantations in Jamaica, when you think of the worst, most lethal plantation environments in American slavery, those were the kinds of places that the Vassall's plantations were. And so I wanted to give you just an excerpt from the will of Anna Vassall, who is Leonard's mother. And this is an excerpt from her will that's in Houghton Library. And it's a little bit hard to read, so I can read a little piece of it for you. She's giving her grandson William 1,500 pounds from her will. And the way that she gives him 1,500 pounds is that she says, he will have 500 pounds in the most choice young Negro women out of the first ship of Negroes that arrives in this island for sale after he shall arrive at the age of 22 years. 500 more to be laid out in Negro women out of the first ship of Negroes that arrives after his 23rd year, and 500 more to be laid out on choice young Negro women that shall arrive after he attains 24 years. And then he will be marked in the shoulder with my mark, AV, and shall descend to his heirs and their heirs. So she is sort of explicitly giving her grandson young women as a birthday present each birthday for these next 3 years. And then to also talking about how they'll be branded with her initials. So like these are the kinds of plantations that the Vassalls own. Like this is not in any way a small operation or in any way small slavery. Like this is really the worst of the worst. This is from the earlier map. It's just kind of zooming in on two of those plantations. Green River and Newfound River are John and William Vassall's plantations. And if you look at this map, there's something really interesting, pretty close to Green River and Newfound River. And that's this place, the Rebels Barricade. So the Rebels Barricade was a really important site. There was a huge war, an uprising of enslaved people in Jamaica in 1760, sometimes called Tacky's War. Vince Brown actually also has a book about this. It just came out like this year about Tacky's War. But the Rebels Barricade was really close to the Vassall's plantations. And so actually a lot of the sources that we have about Tacky's War are letters that were written to William Vassall from his overseer, who was also his nephew, who lived very close to the Rebels Barricade. This is also completely impossible to read. So I will just summarize for you. This is a letter to William Vassall from his nephew Leonard, and he talks about how at the Rebels Barricade, they captured 200 people. What they bring in alive, we burn, and sometimes we hang in gibbets, 700 men, women, and children. So this is an account, and this document is digitized at Houghton Library too. You can get it through the internet. Describing, putting down this rebellion in just incredibly graphic terms about the torture of these people who were rebels, burning them alive, putting them in gibbets. This is what's happening at the Vassall plantations, near the Vassall plantations. And Leonard, the guy who wrote this letter, writes as if he is participating in it. So this is a Vassall nephew who was born in Massachusetts and went to Jamaica as as his uncle's agent. And this is the stuff he's writing home to his uncle. Now, one thing that may be of interest to you, if you're researching your house, is that these plantations do have records. There are some records in the Jamaica National Archives. There are also records in the UK National Archives. So this is a register. It's like a census from 1817 from the Vassall plantations. I think this one is Green River. Nope, this one is Newfound River. It'll have the people's names. It will have whether they were born in Africa or if they were born in Jamaica. It'll have their ages. And sometimes you can see in the rightmost column, sometimes it'll say if they're a child, like who their parents were, or who, more accurately, who the mother was. And so it is actually possible to get records of the names of people who were enslaved on these plantations. And so if you live in a house that's connected to one of these plantations, it's not just sort of nebulous. You kind of know that there were people enslaved in these places. Like, we can get you a list of the names of some of these people. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the plantations, in 1817, which is kind of past the peak of plantation agriculture in Jamaica, these plantations probably peaked in sort of the 1760s about. But these plantations, Newfound River, 198 people, and Green River, 257 people. And we have letters from William Vassall, lots of letters talking about how he's really trying to get it up to 300 people. Like, he thinks 300 will be the optimal number for his plantation. This is a similar register from Antigua for Thomas Oliver. So this is the register of people who were enslaved by Elmwood, 206 people. And speaking of Elmwood, here's Elmwood. So many of you know it's called Tory Row, right? Many of the people who live here are loyalists. And during the American Revolution, many of them leave, right? That's a story that you may have heard before. They leave, and many of them leave enslaved people behind. They just take what they can and go. And the crown compensated people for what they left behind. So if you live in a house where someone left and filed a claim with the crown, the UK National Archives has those claim receipts, like a file, what they claimed, what they said was in the house, what they lost. And so the file for Elmwood is pretty large. I mean, I can share it with you. It says, what furniture and what wine and how many horses and all of that. But it also has a list of the 11 enslaved people who lived in the house in 1774, because Thomas Oliver counted them as an economic loss and he was trying to get compensation. So here's a list of the people who lived at Elmwood, and it also tells what their jobs were, who was the footman, who was the cook, who was a gardener. Someone who's really interesting is right at the top of the list, Buff, a blacksmith. So this is someone who was enslaved by Thomas Oliver, but he hired him out as a blacksmith. And I think that's really interesting because when we think about blacksmiths in Cambridge, we often think about Longfellow and his village blacksmith, right? His famous poem about the village blacksmith, who's this yeoman, this free white yeoman who's sort of salt of the earth. If you go to the MFA, there's a huge painting of a blacksmith in sort of this like pose of the yeoman that is connected to this poem and this idea of the blacksmith. And so looking at Buff, a blacksmith, who is really a blacksmith in Cambridge in this period, changes how we think about Cambridge, I think, right? That when we think about blacksmiths in Cambridge, it's not just the village blacksmith, it's also enslaved artisans who lived here in Cambridge and did work. We don't know what kind of work Buff did, whether he was shoeing horses or making metalwork that's part of fences, or we're not sure what work he did, but there was some blacksmithing work in Cambridge that Buff did. This, I just wanted you to see, this is William Vassall and his son. And I wanted to talk to you very briefly. I know I'm coming up on time here, but I want to talk to you very briefly about some silver that's at Harvard, right? So these boys, these Vassall boys, were very rich, and Harvard had this status called fellow commoners, where if you were very rich and you went to Harvard, you could pay double tuition at Harvard, and you could give them a silver cup, and then you'd be a fellow commoner. And if you were a fellow commoner, what you got out of that deal was that you got all these special privileges at Harvard. You didn't have to doff your cap to anybody. You didn't have to follow the rules as the same rules as the students. You basically became like exempt from discipline at Harvard. And the Vassalls were rich enough that they did this. They gave Harvard silver and became fellow commoners. Louis Vassall actually paid his tuition with a cask of sugar. Like, he brought a barrel of sugar to campus and put it on the table and was like, that's my tuition payment. These boys with this Caribbean sugar money were super rich, and they were super out of control. They broke every rule at Harvard. Their disciplinary files are a mile long. But Harvard still has these cups that they gave to Harvard to sort of cement their status as fellow commoners. And this silver has been in the past part of Harvard's ceremonial silver. And if you've been to a Harvard inauguration, you might have seen it, an inauguration of a Harvard president, you might have seen it out on the dais, like with the charter and the keys and like all of the Harvard stuff, that, you know, ceremonial stuff. This is just a quote from one of those inaugurations. And actually, the way the Zoom screen is set up, I can't read the whole thing. I can only see half of it, but you can read it, hopefully. And it just says that the silver symbolizes the continuity, right, between Harvard's past and its future. So these objects, which are in the Harvard Art Museums, you can go see them, still are at Harvard and are still used. I mean, they're reevaluating. You know, I'll leave that up to the current committee, how they're reevaluating that. But these things have been meaningful at Harvard in the 20th century. So all through this talk, I've sort of been making this argument that these houses were built with Caribbean sugar wealth, right? They got the money from the plantations, they brought it to New England, and they spent it here. That's the argument I'm making, but I don't have to make it because William Vassall makes it for me. In 1784, when he was writing to the governor of Massachusetts and trying to get his property back because he left during the American Revolution, he tried to make the point that he had spent a lot of money in Massachusetts during his lifetime. And so he says, I expended in said states, because he's also writing to Rhode Island. He had a house there as well. During my residence, nearly 50,000 pounds sterling, every farthing of which I received from my estate in Jamaica. So he, you know, I don't have to say it. William Vassall said it. The money that he spent here in Massachusetts, a lot of money came from Jamaica. I want to leave you with these, but before I go, and I want to take some questions, but before I go, these houses do have this history. They were built by people whose money came from sugar wealth, but they also have a history of the people who were enslaved there. And so I wanted to leave you with just the brief story of Anthony Vassall, Tony Vassall, who's someone who you might have heard about because he's very connected to the history of the Longfellow house. So if you know the house there, Tony was a coachman at the Henry Vassall house, and he was married to Cuba, the woman who came from Isaac Royall's house in Medford, and they had several children. When the Vassalls all left during the American Revolution, Tony and Cuba stayed on John Vassall's estate, on the Longfellow house estate. They set up a little house and a little garden. And when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts went to auction off that property as confiscated, like they confiscated Loyalist property, Tony said, "You can't do that. We're living here." And so he and Cuba petitioned the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for a pension out of the sale of that estate, saying, look, if you're going to sell the estate out from under us, we've built a house here, we've improved an acre and a half, we have a garden, we have a life here. If you're going to sell out from under us, then we need to have compensation. And the Commonwealth of Massachusetts agreed and paid them a pension. And so this is a receipt from Tony's pension payment for £12 in 1792. And you can see he signs, his name is either Anthony or Tony. Some of the legal documents call him Anthony, but he signed his name with a big capital T. So Anthony or Tony. And one really interesting thing about this receipt, which is now in the Harvard archive, it's a new acquisition there. This is the other side of the receipt. It's signed by John Hancock, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And one thing about this receipt is that when you go to the Harvard Archives digital page to see it, they actually have this as the second page, and they have this as the first page. Even though usually you might put this as the first page and this as the second page, because what the archives is doing is recognizing that the thing that's really important to us is that this is a document signed by Anthony Vassall. It's one of a very, very few documents signed by someone who was enslaved in Cambridge, someone who petitioned for his rights, someone who was granted this pension, and that you should see that before you go look at the John Hancock signature. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I'm also happy to connect with anyone if you're doing research about your house and you're interested in something like how do you find the compensation claim in the UK National Archives or something like that. I'm happy to help you with that. Also those censuses from Caribbean plantations, I can direct you to those.
Thanks, Caitlin. Whoa. So I think while everyone is maybe processing everything that you just talked about and forming some questions, again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I guess I'm just really curious about how this research journey was for you. And it couldn't have been easy. And I would just love to hear a little bit about, you know, what you discovered and what you learned and how that had an impact on you.
Yeah. So I had been working with the Harvard End Slavery Project since about 2011. Students had done a lot of the initial research, and then as a grad student, I was sort of checking their work, making sure it was all great, which it was. It was fabulous. The students did amazing work. I think for me, one of the most important moments was when I went to the UK National Archives and actually found the censuses that had all the names of the enslaved people on them. And not just names, but also birthplaces, ages, parents' names, sometimes baptismal names. So they, you know, I know I went very fast through all of that, but on the Newfound River plantation, many of them had surnames that were not Vassall, right? And so getting to know those people's names, I felt was really one of the best things I did in that project, because I feel like even if people sort of know generally that there's a connection to these plantations, it can seem kind of vague and nebulous, right? That, okay, Isaac Royal owned a plantation in Antigua, or William Vassall owned a plantation in Jamaica, and that can seem abstract. And so finding the actual names of people is, I think, very powerful in making it concrete and also making it actionable. You know, at Harvard, there's a little plaque on the law school campus that sort of vaguely talks about the wealth that made it possible for Harvard Law to exist came from people who were enslaved in Antigua. But like, I have 206 of their names. Like we could make that more known. So I think that was the most powerful moment in the research to me.
Cool. Liz Adams asks that so President John Adams was strongly anti-slavery. I wonder how he felt about living at Peacewoods. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, no, that is a really good question. I know that they didn't like the house very much, that they changed it a lot. It's a very different house. it was a much sort of smaller and older house. They expanded it a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you really come up against when you're talking about this 18th century New England history is that pretty much any nice house is gonna be connected to the Atlantic slave economy in one or two steps, right? There are a couple of exceptions. Christopher Gore got very rich buying public debt and screwing over poor people. Like, there are other ways to make money in 18th century America, but most of the fancy houses and the fancy stuff come from wealth from the Atlantic economy. So it's only a couple steps away, even if it's the Adamses.
Yeah. Liz's follow-up question, is there a plaque at Elmwood? We know that there's the plaque
There's not an official, so there are only two official Harvard plaques. There's one at the law school and there's one at Wadsworth House, the yellow house on Harvard Yard, that acknowledges 4 of the enslaved people who lived there: Titus, Venus, Juba, and Bilhah. But as far as I know, there's not a plaque at Elmwood. That would be great to do a plaque at, I don't know what the Harvard and Slavery Initiative is doing anymore. I'm no longer affiliated with them. But one of the things I did talk to people when I was working there was I talked to people in the anthropology department about how amazing it would be to do an archaeological excavation of any of these houses, actually. There's a fantastic book by Alexandra Chan, who ran the archaeological dig at the Royal House, just about all the things that they found doing an archaeological dig that they couldn't possibly have found in the historical records, right? Just this level of detail about where the enslaved people gathered to play, or there was a lot of like dairying equipment that they hadn't really known too much about. It would be great to do an excavation at Elmwood, or actually any of the houses at Brattle Street. If anyone wants to do an archaeological excavation, that would be awesome.
Yeah. We'll put that on the list. Yeah.
You might get some students who would be interested in, like, that's up to you if you want people digging, but yeah.
Cool. We have, let's see, Emily over at Longfellow says they're working on plans for a dig over there. So that's exciting.
That's amazing. Good luck. That's great.
Stay tuned. Catherine is asking, can you say more about the enslaved people's family connections and how to find that evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first place to start is at Royal House and Slave Quarters, because that museum has done tremendous work documenting the lives of enslaved people who lived there. Also, Harvard has a dataverse of petitions, just digitized petitions. I can actually send around like some links to some databases that many people might find helpful. So things like Tony and Cuba's petition, or Belinda Sutton's petition, Belinda Sutton, who was enslaved by Isaac Royal. There's a whole set of these petitions in the 1780s that talk about some family connections, talk about people, and the fact that they were all submitting these similar petitions kind of suggests that there was still communication among this extended family and friend network among all of the people connected to the royals. Of course, the most reliable place where people show up is in wills, right? So when a slave owner dies, who they've willed enslaved people to, and that's where we know a lot about Cuba and her mother Abba and her 5 siblings who came from the Royal House to the Henry Vassall house. But I would say if you're interested in starting to look for people, absolutely start with the Royal House. And then also, if you are in a house that does have a loyalist claim, that's like a gold mine of information.
Excellent. Yeah. So I will say then, I don't want to put her on the spot, but our intern Esha, if she's there, she's been with us for the last couple months, whatever month this is, and hey Esha, do you want to say a little bit about your project?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Like Marika said, I'm an intern working with Cambridge Historical Society for the last few months, and we're working on a lot of things as part of this project, but two of the main ones is trying to come up with a sort of resource hub so that folks like you who have questions about this history in Cambridge, you have one place you can go and learn about all the wonderful work that's going on in Cambridge that can help support you in learning more. And we're also hopefully developing a walking tour that focuses on Black folks free and enslaved in Cambridge in the 18th century. So around the revolution. Did I miss anything, Marika?
No, it's awesome. Yeah, we're going to have a couple programs coming up. So shameless plug here. If you're not following the society and our various efforts, just do so. Go to our website and the thing will pop up where you can type in your email address and get on our mailing list. We're also on all the socials as well. So to follow along. Thanks, Asha. They're going to be great. So stay tuned for those. I just want to make sure we can, I'm conscious of the time, but I want to make sure that we can hit some of these questions. So Anne Marie is asking if you can talk about Appleton Street and the Appleton rum connection in Jamaica.
I do not know about the Appleton rum connection in Jamaica, but if that's something that you're interested in finding more about, I would be happy to look into that. I mean, you say Appleton, and that actually gets at a really important point of something that I didn't really talk about in this talk, which is Brattle Street and cotton, right? The Appletons are a big cotton family, big cotton manufacturing family. And there are several houses on Brattle Street that are a little bit later that are really connected to the cotton economy. Not just, again, Longfellow House, which, intersects in a lot of ways here through Fanny Appleton, but also Greenleaf House, which is number 76 on Brattle Street, which was home to a cotton trader who spent 6 months of the year in Cambridge and 6 months of the year in New Orleans trading cotton. So I didn't talk about the cotton economy at all, but you say Appleton, and that's where my mind goes. I don't know anything about their rum connections, but that's really interesting and I think worth exploring.
Cool, right on. So I will say that per Esha's point, we are going to collect as much information as possible and put it all on our website. So we don't want, our goal is to have people stop reinventing the wheel and have one place they can go to find information. So anything Caitlin gives us about anything we talked about tonight, we'll put it all up on the website and you'll be able to access it easily. Yeah, I want to toss it to maybe anyone who wants to say any parting words, but Emily, do you want to say anything about what you're up to at Longfellow in this regard or about any regard?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you, Caitlin. And it's really fascinating and important to be hearing this and to be gathered together with this group. So really looking forward, and thanks for pulling us all together here. I think this is kind of all starting to come together at a good time, a powerful time at the Longfellow House for, at least several years, if not longer. There have been different threads of research. I know Caitlin's presented before. Folks have been looking into the history of Tony and Cuba Vassall. And we're really focused right now on bringing these stories up in the mix of interpretation. And so, really looking at the Longfellow House as a site to interpret the history of enslavement in New England, the wealth of slavery in New England, as well as the experiences of the enslaved people at the site. And it's powerful to look at it in the context of this whole neighborhood and the larger community in Cambridge. And so, we've been thinking for at least the last few years about how to really effectively tell these stories, continue to do research with a public audience who doesn't necessarily come to the Longfellow House currently expecting to hear those stories. And, the Royal House, I think, is really for all of us, a wonderful example and an inspiration in that regard. But in any case, so this is really current for us in terms of thinking about what suite of stories that we're able to represent at the site. The question of memorialization, a plaque, how are we physically representing the legacy of enslaved people on the site? And, people who in some way sort of self-emancipated at the site, right? They seized their freedom, they petitioned, they got that. Anyway, so I can talk about this for a long time, but we're excited that the archaeological work is coming up. We are also, I think, have 2022 a project hopefully funded to do additional research into the Black history of the site. So Caitlin, I'm sure we'll be in touch. We'll be in touch with like everybody here. It's a good time to be doing this work. So it's overdue for us for sure. But it's good to be in conversation with everybody in this group and look forward to the work going forwards.
Great, thank you. It's been really interesting. I so appreciate everyone coming and sharing where they're at, especially to Caitlin. I guess a round of applause is in order. If everyone can, we can't see you.
Can I say something?
Oh, sure.
Caitlin, I just want to thank you very much. That was really powerful. And it was particularly powerful for me because I was born and raised in Jamaica. And the history of the violence against the slaves in Jamaica is well documented. It was one of the most brutal, regimes. And I live on Appleton, right around the corner. And it'll be very interesting to walk the streets and have my mind wonder, what exactly happened behind those walls and how connected I am to something like that. So it was a terrific presentation, but a really tough one. Very personal at this level. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Yeah. So I'll find you because I need to know more.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah,
I know it from the other side.
sure.
But I don't know it from this side.
Absolutely. And there are so many records and there are so many digital records now that if you or if anyone who's listening, has questions, I'm happy to answer questions by email. And Esha knows that I can send an email full of very badly formatted links that you can follow to many different online resources. But there's fabulous stuff that's being digitized through the Harvard Colonial North America project, or even places like Ancestry.com now have more and more resources about slavery, especially slavery in the Caribbean. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. It's giving us all a lot to think about. And I think that's a sign of a good program. I really appreciate everybody coming and sharing their stories and asking great questions. It's just the spirit that we want to have and encourage in our group. So again, thank you to Caitlin. Yay. And yeah, thank you for coming to our first TRAC meeting. This has been really fun. I've learned a lot. I'm excited to talk more about how we can best work together, how we can best answer your questions, what are you curious about. I think that this is, when I think about this group, I like to think of it ending. I don't think it will. I think that this is a journey that will be on for a long time. And so this is our first step in that journey. And I'm really excited that you're here with me. So my gratitude to you all. I might send a follow-up email or something, but I have all of your information. So you'll certainly be on my list and look for exciting and fun things to come. Hooray. Thank you, everybody. There's some nice closing comments coming in. I appreciate that. Well, take care, everybody, and we will see you around.